So it turns out the design of this EVO 8 and 9 front subframe is pretty much garbage. So we're going to walk through dropping this front subframe, and I'm going to point out some areas that really bother me with the design. Then we're also going to install this Whiteline steering precision kit. And finally, we'll take a nice tour of the underneath side of our new Red EVO shell. Welcome back, guys. It's Paul with another voiceover video, and again, we're going to dive into this front cross member, front center member, front K-frame, whatever you want to call this thing, and kind of how this design is just so poor. Obviously, it blocks a lot of stuff when you want to be able to get to your steering rack. Doing anything with your steering rack is really hard to do without pretty much dropping this whole front subframe. And also, the main flaw here is really that there are these internally welded nuts in certain areas where you need to bolt things down to this front frame that basically just end up breaking off or just getting messed up. And then when they're messed up, you really don't have a lot of options to fix them. Like this, this is where the steering column is supposed to be bolted down on that front center member that came with this red car, and the bolts, the nuts that were welded inside were like broken off. So an option here, I started to drill a hole through the bottom, and then I was going to do a bigger hole with a hole saw, so I could do a nut and bolt combination going through. But I really don't know how much that would mess with the structural integrity of, this whole front member here. And another reason I think it's, kind of a garbage design is that there is literally a safety recall on this, because as many of you have seen in my other video, this was the Silver EVO where this front lower control arm was literally ready to basically be ripped out. So good on Mitsubishi for doing a recall on this. I'll link to this video in the video description down below if you haven't seen it yet and you want to check it out. But basically, you need to be able to drive your car in to have them do this recall, and it's only kind of if it's so rusty that they could punch a hole through it and then they'd replace it for you potentially. It doesn't actually help if bolts are stripped or these nuts are broken off inside, unfortunately. But again, you can see how bad it can get. And, it was less than 3 years ago, probably only 2 years ago, that this subframe on the silver car was replaced. The Mitsubishi dealer changed it out, put a brand new one in, even gave me some new lower control arms while I was at it. So when I did pick up this Red EVO shell, I was like, great. I should have this brand new front subframe to put in if I need it. So that's why I had to work out in the cold and out in the mud to remove that front subframe from the silver car, because I was like, well, this one should be in great shape because it's not that old at all. Everything should be fine. And of course, this was because I found out, the original subframe that came with the red car had those strip bolts where you would bolt down the actual steering column. So I would have had to fix those somehow. And also the lower control arm on the driver's side where it bolts in the front was actually stuck as well. It was, the bolt is like kind of basically fused to the bushing, so you could only turn it so far and it would hold on that bushing inside. So again, and you can't really get in there, you can't do anything with it. It's just, there's nothing open about this really. It's all kind of contained in a weird way where you cannot do much with this front center member. And again, this one was less than 3 years old from being brand new, but bolts started breaking off. I had to make sure I heated up all the bolts to remove the sway bars. Actually, the first one that I didn't heat up, I accidentally broke off, so we had to drill that one out. And then while drilling it out, it literally drilled enough where it basically just broke the nut free inside that we were trying to drill into. So it was another fruitless exercise, really. Luckily, there is a hole close enough by where I think I will just be able to sneak a bolt in through the bottom and then put a nut on top. I'm still not sure yet how I'm going to for surely make this work, but that's hopefully what's going to happen when I use this current subframe. And honestly, I didn't think I was going to be able to use either one of these subframes because I didn't film it very well, but just showing you there's that motor mount that goes above the power steering rack. And where that bolts down, when this was in the silver car, I was complaining about this in my last video, actually, I'm pretty sure, but like I couldn't get that one out. But once I dropped it down, I could get at it better from the top and try to get it free. And of course, I didn't want to round off the top of the bolt itself. I basically had to pound on a socket, try to get it on there. And then as I was starting to remove it, luckily it was just the socket slipping off. But at the time, I thought it was the nut inside of that front center member. I thought it was that nut inside there that was already breaking free. So I was like, well, if that's screwed up on this one, both of these front subframes are pretty much garbage. Luckily, that didn't turn out to be the case, and I was able to get that nut free. I was not filming myself doing that because honestly, at that point, I was just pretty mad that I thought neither one of these was going to work very well. So really, long story long, what ended up happening is I'm taking the new-ish front subframe from the silver car, and I'm going to install it in the red car, and there's only one area that I need to kind of make work, and that's where the sway bar is actually mounted down. Anyway, enough of me complaining. Let's go ahead and show dropping this front subframe. So of course, this wasn't even really part of my original plan because I was going to leave this subframe in because I thought it was fine. So I did remove my steering rack already. My steering rack is already pulled out. But you got to do those two larger bolts in the back, and then there's two nuts where it holds onto the subframe that I already removed here, and of course access to a hoist and using these stands. I just took those out and then lifted the car up a little bit, and then I was able to remove my front subframe. It's actually not as heavy as I thought it would be. So when it comes to the steering column and where it hooks up to the steering rack, mine is more exposed here. There is a plastic cover that usually you would have to remove to get to this. You do remove that cover from the inside of the car. There are some bolts you would remove. And then, of course, you remove this one bolt that holds the steering column to the steering rack, and then it should come out. Then, depending on the level of what you plan to drop, I just decided to remove the outer tie rod ends here from the steering rack. Give those a tap on the side, helps wiggle them free. Bigger hammer, the better there. And then that should help give you the ability to drop down your front subframe. And I did remove my steering rack at first because I didn't think, I needed to actually drop my subframe. So I just pulled out my steering rack when I thought I was just going to do these bushings and change the bushings and put this steering rack back in this original cross member in this car. So now I'm just working on removing some of the power steering lines and removing the steering rack from the silver car. So this is the front subframe that I am going to, of course, install into the Red EVO, but I did not trust this old rack. This one was definitely really rusty, but it is good to have for reference points for knowing to run all the lines and everything I need to put in place. So I'm popping out the old steering rack here and then checking everything over, checking all the threads over, make sure everything's good. Of course, because that's a big deal, is making sure all the threads, those nuts that I was talking about that are encased, make sure they have good threads and they're not messed up at all. So I removed my sway bar and then removed my steering rack as well. And now you can see the full front subframe here. But of course, while doing this, I was like, man, there's probably some better options out there. And so I started digging and I did some research and I wanted to share what I found with you guys. There are a bunch of aftermarket tubular front end subframes you could buy for the Evo. Now, there's a bunch of things to consider before you actually do this, and actually I'm hoping people can help me out. As always, my other viewers that have EVOs, if you have an aftermarket subframe, let me know what one you have and if you actually like it. And also let me know more about if my concerns are true or not, as far as it being, of course, maybe just more stiff, and then also like having more NVH, so it's got more noise, vibration, harshness, I feel like I wouldn't want this on a street car, but at the same time, after dealing with all this bull crap with this front subframe, if I had to do it all over again, I'm not against spending the money, actually, I don't think, at this point, for something that's actually a little easier to work with and just a better design. But anyway, I listed all of these ones I found on the screen. Let me know if you have any one of these installed in any of your EVOs, and also let me know if I missed any options. Now we're going to move on to installing this Whiteline precision kit, and this just came with the car. I didn't actually really plan to buy it, but since it came with the car, I thought I was going to install it, and that's how I started my day before I knew I was going to actually swap subframes all over the place. But it does come with these bushings and these spacers. There's basically two bushings where you bolt down the rack itself, and then the one spacer that holds up the steering rack. And again, those spacers you'll need because, as we're going to see, the difference between the OEM rubber piece and this aftermarket one. This aftermarket one from Whiteline is a lot thicker on the bottom. So what I think is really happening here is you're just kind of lifting up this whole steering rack. You're bringing the steering rack up higher where it sits in this front subframe. So again, I know I'm jumping around here if you're watching my full video just for updates on my Evo, but if you were just trying to do this when you lowered it down a little bit to just change these bushings, you would of course need to be able to remove these two bolts here that kind of hold down this bushing part of our steering rack. And I also like having this stuff included in my videos just in case someone wanted to reference like what way, you know, this mounting plate goes and how it's bolted down, stuff like that. I use it myself sometimes too, just to see, make sure I know what way things are supposed to go. This OEM rubber piece has a slit in it. It's cut almost all the way through, but not quite. And now we're going to cut back to when the steering rack is out of the car, and you can see I already started pounding out these old bushings. The old ones came out a lot easier than I thought they would. You would kind of just want to use a socket or something that's just small enough to fit through that hole, and then a hammer, and then you should just be able to pound out those old bushings. So of course I went ahead and pounded out the bushings on both sides, cleaned up the area a little bit, make sure there wasn't any big pieces of debris in there, and then we got our new bushings ready to go in place. And these also went in quite a bit easier than I thought they would as well, honestly. So those bushings kind of split in half. There's a top and a bottom half. So for that polyurethane part, I think it's made out of, for those black pieces, you know, they split. So I put one on the top, one on the bottom, and then I put a little bit of the grease on here on these pins, and then these pins just slid right in. I thought I'd have to push them in somehow or pound them in, but they pretty much just slid right in. Again, I think the main thing here is obviously it's probably a little bit stiffer than OEM, but also I think it's a little bit thicker. I think this is going to raise up, this is part of what's also going to raise up your whole steering rack a little bit. But again, I couldn't find, I looked online to see if there's more info on this, and I really couldn't find much of anything, especially with videos of people doing this. I found the instructions from Whiteline, which I find a little bit comical, especially because I don't know, everything I'm doing is not a bushing, it's just a bush according to the instructions, which seems weird to me, but I might be wrong. All that is to say, I might have done something wrong here too. So if you've installed these before and you think I did anything wrong, please let me know, because I can actually fix it yet before I go much further with this car. And of course, while I was at it, this is the power steering line that gave me so much trouble on the Silver EVO, and the reason it was kind of parked because this little line right here broke or rusted out. But this is the one that came with the red car, so I just had to put it in and tighten it up. And again, real quickly, just showing you the difference between this OEM bushing that goes around the rack and the aftermarket one. You can see how much thicker it is towards the bottom on this one. And that's also why you need those nuts or those washers that I'm putting in place here. I put those washers in, set them over the holes that you would put the bolts down in. And that's going to space out that enough for that thickness that we added basically within that aftermarket piece. So of course we're going to set this steering rack down in place, line up the bolts. Please make sure you take your time getting these bolts started. They should start with your fingers. Don't cross that anything in here. It'd make things so much worse for you. Take your time with this stuff if you're doing it. I also found new bolts. I'm going to put a part number on the screen actually for these new bolts. I just ordered them, so I don't have them yet. But I have new bolts to bolt down the steering rack because they seem like a rare kind of size and they got big washers on them. So I would recommend buying new bolts most likely right away because they're only like a couple bucks a piece. I'd spend the extra $10 and make sure you got some bolts that also aren't going to get seized or broke off in there. And of course, now we need to put that mounting plate out on the top of that other bushing. I think it's called the bushing. I assume it's a bushing. I don't know. If my terminology is wrong, I apologize. But we're going to put these two bolts back in to hold this in place as well, of course, and then tighten those up. So if you bought this kit just to install it and your car's working fine, you'd probably want to hold off and not do it until you plan on doing something else at the time. Otherwise, it might not be worth the effort, honestly. So I'm just going to cut to showing you exactly what it looked like when it's in the car. You can see how kind of this spacer makes it a little bit higher up here where it's bolted in. And then, of course, the spacers back here as well with those washers and how that kind of gives that extra room for your steering rack to stay up a little bit higher and adjusting, you know, where the geometry basically of your steering. Back to documentation's sake of fixing this Evo, I put this, I think this was the return line. I put this power steering line in place as well right away before I started getting this front subframe back up in place. Again, front subframe was a little bit lighter than I thought. I was able to just kind of lift it up and then use these stands to hold it in place as I reinstalled it. honestly, I'm going to have to do this again because I didn't get my sway bar in place yet because I really just needed to make sure this car could roll and steer again, because that's part of what happens when you don't have a place where you can just leave the car sit forever. I'll take a heated garage whenever I can get it, but since it's not mine, I need to make sure the car could be moved in and out. So I'm probably going to drop, honestly, the whole thing again. But I did get at least some things swapped out, and I'm happy that I know mostly things are going to be fine with this other front subframe. And I will also learn along the way, I guess, whether or not I need to fully drop down this K-frame or front subframe to get my sway bar up in place or not. But I know I'm going to have to do something. I know it won't just slide in there very easily. So I still got to get my sway bar in there. And I also got to attach a couple other things when it comes to where the steering column goes through the firewall and do stuff like that I just wasn't ready to do at the time. So this is just kind of a temporary get things in place situation. But while I'm at it, I want to show you more up close with these bolts that hold. So these kind of studs that are in place here where the nut bolts in to hold this front subframe. You can see this one was actually kind of loose. Not loose to the point where it wouldn't tighten up, but it kind of, you could see the bolt in there moving up and down. So that was interesting to me because as I move over to the passenger side one, that one was completely tight. You couldn't wiggle it at all. So, I mean, the good news is, obviously, I could still get this one. Both of them would tighten up. The part that I'm not sure if I should be concerned about is that this one does, the other one does move at all. But I guess we'll see. So I just used these stands to lift up this front subframe in place and then put the nuts on. I felt like it was good to just use the nuts to help hold it up and then just get them started, of course. Like anything else with this stuff, you usually don't want to just tighten. If you have like 4 main points of contact, don't just tighten one of them up completely. That's just going to make things harder for the other ones. And then we're going to take our new lower control arms here and we're going to slide those in place as well, because of course you'll want those up in place before you put those large bolts in the back to hold this whole subframe up. And of course, we're going to do that on both sides. As I mentioned, that's part of the reason I'm changing this subframe as well, because I couldn't even get this lower control arm on the driver's side out of the other subframe because that front bolt had the bushing kind of seized to it. So I did put anti-seize in all these bolts basically because I am way more worried about them never coming out again than I am with them slowly like loosening up on me. Which I will say has happened though, honestly. I thought I had a bad bushing once and it was the bolt that started coming loose a little bit. So who knows? Can't always win. But I'm also sometimes racing, you know, out on rough surfaces, bouncing around a bit. So maybe that's why I came loose. But again, if you pay attention to your car, and whatever, you do you, but like I just was again more concerned about this stuff never coming out and being rusted in place than I am about having to check it and make sure it's tight. Now a tip for this back portion here, what I did is I kind of tipped it up and then there's these little smaller bolts that can hold it in place. I recommend tightening these bolts first when you're putting your subframe back in place, because then you kind of have it lined up a bit better for these really long bolts that hold that lower control arm in place and hold your, you know, the rear part of your front subframe in. That seemed to work well for me anyway. So of course we're going to tighten that up and then we're going to do it on the other side as well. Same thing, it just seemed to help to start that smaller bolt first. Again, just make sure you have things lined up. These should be able to start with your fingers. Use your hands to tighten them. Because if you're using the impact on these, you could just mess up the threads, and you definitely don't just want to mess up the threads where you can't access them. But that's about it. That is reinstalling a front subframe in the Red EVO. We're making some progress. And now we're going to take a look underneath and see what this one looks like. You can see there's a little bit of surface rust on the bumper there, but look at those chassis legs. They're actually like there, unlike the silver car. The only holes in those legs are the ones that were there from the factory, so that's good. Little bit of surface rust up in here. Everything looks pretty clean though overall. Still got our factory mustache bar in place here. Not sure if I'm going to do anything with that yet. On the passenger side, our driver's side, I mean, it's a little harder to see this rail, but it looked just like the one on the passenger side to me as far as, rust amount. It didn't look like it had any rust. And now we're underneath. One of the worst spots on this car is actually this driver's side rear floor. It is rusted through a little bit there, but that's one of the least, that structural integrity part there does not, concern me. It's not a structurally integral part of the car. It's just part of the floor there, so it's not as big a deal. It's kind of a weird spot to rust out, honestly. And if you didn't notice, this is actually when the original front subframe was in. So this is before I started doing all the work on it. I just wanted to take a video underneath, take a look. Up here, this front part of the frame looks much better than the Silver EVO did as well. And of course, just going down like this too looks nice. And we got our OEM US market fuel tank as well. So that's nice on this car. But there you have it. That's about it for this video, everybody. Thanks so much for tagging along and watching me build another Evo. As always, I appreciate your information that you might have, especially in this video, about potential subframes, front subframes you may have ran. I guess rear too. I know they make aftermarket rear subframes. Let me know your experiences with them if you have one. But as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching. I just want to say that domestic violence is never okay. If you or someone you know is experiencing issues with a partner and doesn't feel safe, please visit the website thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-SAFE.